When you get home from a trip, no matter how much fun it was, I think the first thing you want to do is put your feet up and take a look at the photos you took. I'm Rebecca Kemp Brent with a fun idea for using your photos on something you can put your feet up on. It's called a Tuffet, and it's a lot of fun to put together. I started with the inside parts, which you can get in a kit, and also pre-printed foundation patterns, which come either on fusible interfacing that you fuse to a layer of muslin, or you can go ahead and purchase it already printed on the muslin itself, which is what I'm going to demo on today. Both of them work really well. And if you've ever done any foundation piecing, maybe made some quilt blocks that way, then you're already familiar with the technique I'll be showing you in just a minute. The second secret for my Tuffet is I had some custom fabric printed with my photographs. This is a wonderful way to bring these photos out into the open, and you have a selection of different fabrics that you can have your photos printed on. You take them into a little bit of software, which is really easy now that most of us take our photos digitally. And you can either use the software that's provided by the company that will be doing the printing, or if you're adept at using some photo editing software of your own, then you can arrange your photos, crop them, and I sort of went with the idea of making a random stack of photographs, as if I'd been looking at them and just tossed them out on my table. One tip I'll give you, just to differentiate between the photos a little bit, I've surrounded each one with a 20 pixel wide white outline. That's a little bit reminiscent of an older photograph that used to come with borders, but it also serves that function of giving the eye a definition for where the end of one photo is and the next one begins. You'll also need just a couple of other things. You need to have feet if you want to put those on your Tuffet, and you also will need a very large button to cover and some good firm drapery cord. And this is one of my favorite notions because it's just so unusual. This is a 12-inch long upholstery needle, and I'm going to use that in making the Tuffet to put the button on the top and sew all the way through this big stack of material. But that comes a little bit later. First of all, let me show you how this foundation is put together. As I said, I'm using the pre-printed foundation, and the printed side is actually going to be on the bottom, and then you're going to stack your photo fabric on top. You want to be sure that the photo fabric covers the edges of your outline, and when you're digitizing your photos, remember that you're going to lose about 3/4 of an inch around the edges in your seam allowance. There's a really generous seam allowance on these pieces just to give you some wiggle room during the assembly. And maybe even more important is that down here at the bottom, you'll lose between 2.5 and 4 inches when the fabric wraps around underneath the bottom of the foam Tuffet form. So just keep that in mind, and don't put your favorite photos there. Instead, put them sort of in this middle area. And you'll notice that my photos don't cover the entire printed panel. That's because I wanted to put a contrasting fabric in between, again, to give the eye a little resting place and sort of make a frame for my photos. Not to mention the fact that I'm going to stick some decorative top stitching on it because I like to sew, and that's a great way to incorporate a little bit more needle and thread work into the project. I don't always pin when I'm sewing things together, but this is a project where you definitely want to use pins, and plenty of them. And one of the reasons is that this is a straight piece of fabric. If you like to use the pre-cut fabric strips, you can use those to make some of your Tuffet patterns. In this case, I've cut a piece that's twice as wide as usual because I'm going to substitute it for 2 of these areas that are printed on my pattern. But since that's straight and the edge of my fabric with the photos on it has a bend, I need to be sure that I pin things so that this edge lies nice and flat. Then you take it to the machine, sew your seam by flipping this upside down. You sew with this part on top, and that means all you have to do is stitch right along the printed line. So you really can't go wrong. And when you've finished 8 of these panels, you'll sew them all together. We'll come back to that in just a minute, but for now, if you'll come over to the machine with me, I'd like to show you how I did the top stitching. I have a couple of little hints to give you for making the top stitching really stand out. I'm using a slightly heavier thread on my machine. This particular one is just a little bit bigger, a little thicker than a normal sewing thread, and I have the regular all-purpose thread in the bobbin. Because I have a heavier thread in my needle, I'm using a size 14 top stitching needle, which has a little bit bigger eye to accommodate that heavy thread. And one thing you'll need to remember is not to use your automatic needle threader with this heavier thread. Sometimes the extra size of the thread is just a little bit too much and you might damage the hook on your needle threader. So this is one time when I will do the automatic threading all the way down to the eye, but then I want to put the thread through the eye by eye instead of doing it automatically. I'm also going to use two different feet for my top stitching. One of them is our regular general purpose foot, which of course is the best one to use for straight stitching. But this other foot is the one that's intended for blind hem stitching. And the reason I'm choosing to use it for top stitching is this little metal foot underneath. That usually rides along the fold of your hem for the blind hem, but I'm going to use it to guide perfectly spaced top stitching right along the edge of my seam. So let's install that on the machine. And then I'm going to make a couple of adjustments to my tension and my length. I want a longer stitch for the heavier thread, and I'm going to reduce the tension just a bit. The reason for that is so that the lighter weight thread that I have in the bobbin won't be pulled to the surface of my work. And then the last adjustment that we can make, if we need to, I'm going to lower my presser foot so that the toe of this foot, that little wall, is right in the seam that I've already sewn. And then use the hand wheel to make sure that your needle is not going to strike the foot. In this case, it would. So I need to go in and move my needle position just a little bit to the left. But you can play with this so that you can get different spacing. The farther you go to the left, the farther away from the seam your stitches will appear. So let's try about 1.5 millimeters to the left, and then we're ready to sew. And all I have to do to guide this is make sure that the toe or the wall on the foot stays right there along my seam line. Remember that you're going around just a little bit of a gentle curve in the middle of your foundation piece. And you may also notice at this point that the piece of your tuffet is not lying completely flat, and that's because you basically stitched a dart into it. Now, it's also better if you don't use the automatic thread cutter with that heavier thread. So instead, I'll pull out the thread tail and cut those. And you see I have this really nicely spaced edge stitching. I wanted to add a little more top stitching, so I'm going to do a second row. For that, I don't want my guiding foot. Instead, I'm going to go back to my all-purpose foot and put that on the machine. I don't need to adjust the length setting or the tension because I want it to look the same as my original line of stitching. But once again, I may be needing to change the needle position. To gauge that this time, I'm going to lower my presser foot so that the right hand edge of the foot lies exactly along the stitches that I've already put in. And this is, it's kind of precise if you want to have the most precise result. So make a note mentally about whether you're guiding with the edge of the foot just to the left of your row of stitching, or is the edge of the foot just to the right of your row of stitching. Even that one little bit of thread, about 0.5 millimeter, makes a difference in the way your top stitching looks, and you don't want it to waver. Then you move the needle, change that needle position to get it where you want it to be in relation to what you've already sewn. I want it about 1/4 of an inch away, and I know that on my machine that means 5.5 millimeters puts it in just the right position to be 1/4 of an inch away from the right hand edge of my foot. Once we have that in position, we're ready to go again. And you'll notice sometimes it's a little hard even for me to control the machine at that slower speed. But if you have a control on your machine and you can set the speed to be slower, then you don't have to worry about that lead foot problem or about an uneven stitching speed. So that was really too slow. I'm going to go with medium, and then you just chug right along, watching the edge of your presser foot until you get the entire row of top stitching all finished. Now I'm going to stop there so I can, and even I forget, I used my automatic scissor, which is okay with this thread, but I do recommend that you cut it manually instead. That's a safer option for your machine. So once I finished with the top stitching, then we flip this to the wrong side again, and we just trim away all of the excess fabric. You can see it's conveniently marked with a little pair of scissors, so I know exactly where I need to cut. And then we have 8 of these panels that are all completed and trimmed and ready to sew together. Come back with me over to the table and we'll look at the tuffet, and I will take you through just a quick overview of what happens next to put your tuffet together. I added a couple of extra details to my tuffet. Since I have the covered button on the top, I used my embroidery machine to stitch a design right in the middle of the fabric that covers the button. And then there's sort of a secret hiding underneath. If I flip the tuffet up, you can see that I've listed on the bottom all of the places and the dates when I took my photographs, and that adds to the sentimental value of it for me. For a project like that, you need to use a small lettering size, and for small lettering, there's a thread called micro thread that's available, which is actually a much finer thread, more like a bobbin thread instead of your regular weight embroidery thread. And I would always use the micro thread when I'm sewing tiny letters. Here's a sample that you can look at that has 1/8 of an inch tall letters on it. And the top one is sewn with the micro thread, the bottom one is sewn with regular embroidery thread. Then it's just a matter of putting everything together. The kit already has the holes drilled in the base. You'll assemble your 8 panels of fabric into a sort of tube, pull it over the top, and run a gathering thread around the bottom. Put your button on the top, pull everything together, and when you're finished, just think, you can literally sit down, put your feet up, and enjoy your work.